Euthanasia is so important, not only for veterinarians to understand, but also incredibly important for livestock owners, uh, because the reality is that most of the time the veterinarian is not available or not going to be readily available, let's say, in those situations where um, an untimely accident occurs and euthanasia is necessary on an emergency basis. So it's so important that livestock owners know the techniques, know the methods, so that they can apply this procedure in such a way that it's totally humane for the animal. Um, the methods that we use in euthanasia are designed to cause an immediate loss of consciousness that's followed by death and no distress or pain to the animal. That is our objective, and we have ways to do that. And it's so important we apply those when we need to.
There are a few different ways that you can humanely euthanize an animal, but I think we should focus today on firearms. So let's just start with the basics. What firearms are acceptable?
We find that anything generally larger in terms of rifles, let's say, if we're talking about rifles, most people have a 22 long rifle, but the 22 long rifle is probably just a little bit under what you need certainly for doing adult cattle. There's no doubt that there's a lot of animals euthanized with a 22 long rifle, but if you look at the muzzle velocity and the speed of the bullet, it's insufficient really to be consistently effective. So our recommendation, at least in AVMA guidelines, and it was based on some work that was done here in Canada and some that was done in the U.S., and not based on a lot of animal numbers. And so we probably need to, well, not probably, we do need to do more research along those lines. But the results of at least two of those studies suggested that the 22 rifle was a little bit under what was needed effectively to euthanize animals. And so the recommendation that we came up with was to use a 22 Magnum rifle would be better. 22 Magnum or higher caliber rifle. There are some challenges when you get too high, because then the bullet is likely to exit the skull, and then that becomes a problem as well. So 22 long rifle, a 22 Magnum is much better, and probably 22 Magnum on up to a 223. Those would be wise choices, I think, for euthanasia.
And so focusing on that bullet, there are differences in the appropriateness of the bullet itself, are there not?
Yeah, definitely. We want to usually use a solid point bullet. We want to stay away from hollow point type bullets. Hollow point bullets are great for what we would call center mass type shots, where we're more along the lines of hunting. Hunters use a hollow point bullet because their shots are going into the chest normally. And in that situation, you want something that expands, and you want something that dissipates its energy right away. But when we're using a firearm for euthanasia or a bullet for euthanasia, we want to make sure that the bullet has sufficient muzzle velocity, and we want to make sure that it doesn't fragment so that it will enter the brain and do massive damage to particularly the brainstem, because that's going to be our most effective way for euthanasia.
When we're talking about euthanizing an animal, how far from it, once we've selected the firearm and the appropriate bullet, how far from the animal is ideal?
Normally we want our shots to be within close range. For instance, if we're using a pistol, we definitely want to be close, because with a pistol it's much harder to aim your projectile or I should say, much more difficult to get an accurate shot with a pistol. So with a pistol, we maybe would like to be within a couple of feet of the skull if possible. So that means the animal's got to be down, in many cases moribund. So that works for the handgun situation. Handguns, though, normally closer. With rifles, you can be a little bit further away. But even with rifles, it's not. You don't want to get too far away, or even with shotguns, because we still want to be within 3 to 4 feet most of the time, so that we can accurately place our bullet where we want to.
Yeah, and when we're talking about that accurate placement, inside the skull, what are we targeting for the brain?
There's an area called the brain stem that consists of and it's a combination of structures within the brain stem. We would talk about usually the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the midbrain, the pineal gland. These are all parts of or within the midbrain area. And so when we talk about the midbrain, we're talking about structures within the brainstem that we're attempting to target when we select our anatomical site, because we know that if we do enough damage to those particular structures, death will occur.
And immediate.
Very soon thereafter. It depends how I guess you define death. We know that when you use a firearm or a captive bolt, that even with a well-placed shot, the heart will continue to beat for at least 7 to 8 minutes. And that confuses a lot of people. It doesn't mean that the shot was poor. It doesn't mean that the animal will not likely proceed to death in many cases. But the heart is controlled by the sinoatrial node, which is a structure within the heart muscle itself. And so the heart will continue to beat when an animal has been, even when an animal has been properly euthanized with a firearm or with a captive bolt.
So we know where to target the brainstem. How do we find that location on the exterior of the animal?
That's really critical, and that's where we go to the recommendations that that are really a major change in the way we used to go about it. Our guidelines at the present time recommend that we go from the outside corner of the eye to the opposite horn base, basically where that would be. And that is the current recommendation on the intersection of those two lines, one drawn from the outside, each drawn from the outside corner of the eye to the base of the opposite horn. That's going to place the actual entry site for the projectile much higher than we have used in the past. In the past, we used the inside corner of the eye to the top of the opposite ear, or possibly to the top of the horn, but in either case, very good chance that when you use that anatomical site placement, you're going to end up with a shot that goes too far anterior or too far forward and misses the brain in many cases.
Mm-hmm. And then it's a perpendicular shot once you have located that X, the point at which you should hit it.
Yeah, absolutely. When we use that X, or another way that we might do it is to a line across the pole, another line from the outside corner of each eye, okay, a line across each of those. We go right in the center, will take us to approximately the same location. And for some people, and in feed yard steers as an example, that might be a little easier site to find, okay? That would be going from a line across the top, a line from lateral canthus to lateral canthus. In both cases, okay, either with the X or with that way of finding that site, is most likely going to take the projectile into the brainstem. And that's the reason for using those anatomical sites.
And what if we're further from the animal in the case of maybe it's in a large pen, or we're on the range and it's not a downer animal that we can control that easily? Yeah,
that is a really challenging part, and I know that is quite oftentimes a situation in a feed yard setting or even a cow-calf situation. And that is where I think we need more work done to try to figure out how to better accommodate those situations, because at the present time we do the best we can because it's quite difficult to get close enough to be able to place the bullet exactly where we'd like to. The other thing is, in a standing animal, of course, the front of the skull is in a bit of an angle, so there's potential for ricochet, there's potential for us to miss that site or not aim it in the direction of the brainstem. So these are issues that we have to continue to work on. The ideal situation is when the animal is down and we can get close up. The situations that we find in the beef cattle situation, whether it's cow-calf or feed yard is different. And more work needs to be done there to figure out how to improve our methods for use of firearms there.
Sure. And in an ideal situation, and we've done everything correctly, what does a successful euthanasia look like?
A successful euthanasia would be one where if the animal is standing, it collapses immediately. It will initially be rigid when it hits the ground, let's say, and then as it lies there for a moment, it will begin to relax. It never makes any attempt to rise up or right itself, in other words. We don't want to see any respiration to occur because we knock out the respiratory centers in the brain. That tells us we've had a good shot. And with no respiration, eventually the lack of oxygen will start to proceed toward death for us. And so we don't want to see that. We don't want to see any blinking of the eye. If we put our finger right on the eyeball itself, we don't want to see any reaction by the cow, any blinking from that. Those are all indicators that we probably had a very good shot. No vocalization, all those kinds of things are all what we look for when we're trying to determine whether or not the bullet's been adequately placed. It is a difficult subject indeed, and it's such an important issue because the reality is that in animals there are certain situations and certain circumstances where animals suffer injury or disease, where the pain is excruciating and there's no other way to relieve it. There's no medical means to relieve their misery and suffering. And animals, their mental state is different than that. In humans, for them, it's they understand when they're suffering, but they don't understand like a human might that there is possibly in time a relief that might come with some kind of therapy or something like that. They can't think that way. Those are mental states and ways that only humans can think in. So it's particularly important that we understand the misery that they're suffering, and we need to be sure that we have a means to manage it. If we can manage it medically, that's great. If we can't, then euthanasia needs to be one of the techniques that we're ready to apply. No one wants to do it. No one likes to do it at all. But it's an important part of what we do in the livestock industry to assure the welfare of animals.